I thank you all for coming, for starters. It is fun to be able to give this presentation in front of people and not a screen. So, I really appreciate you folks being here. My goal with this talk is to make this interactive. Because number one, otherwise we're going to be doing jumping jacks. Because I know most of you in the audience are like, holy crap, it's really freaking cold in here. And I'm the person going, oh, this is really comfortable. Because I'm from Buffalo and we like cold. So, all right. So this is a little bit about me. I won't spend a lot of time here. I do a lot of things. I have some degrees. I do a lot of conferences. If you've got questions about me or whatever, the important thing on this slide is sloths. I love sloths. That is my adopted sloth from Buffalo Zoo. His name is Flash. That is the most important thing. Okay. So, oh no. I don't know what's going on. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today. How many of you, first of all, know a whole lot about email attribution and kind of how it all works? All right, so you're probably going to be bored, but hopefully I'll add a little something to maybe you don't already know. And for the rest of you, some of you going like, a little, maybe you'll pick something up you didn't already know. But we'll start with a little bit of history of email. Because a lot of folks who do email and do security, you don't know about the history of email and therefore why we have the problem we have today. And I find it's instructive to have a little piece of that history to understand that part. We're going to talk in particular about something called the envelope versus the header. How many of you have heard of header email headers? Probably most of you, yeah, okay. How many of you know the difference between the envelope and the header? And can articulate that to me? Yeah, like none. So that's why we're going to talk about it, right? Because your users don't know that either. And so when you're trying to understand, did this message originate in the place you think it might have originated, it's really handy to understand how those two pieces are built and why they're different. So we'll talk a little bit about client-server communication, which is where we'll see some of that in action. And then we'll finally get to reading ahead of a message, an actual piece of garbage message that we got at the university. And we'll walk through some of the header, and we'll look at how you read a header and like what's some of the information you can get out of it. We'll talk about finding those headers, because sometimes that's a challenge. And then how do you report this stuff, right? So you know something's phishing, you know it's scamming, you know it's bad. What the hell do you do with it? Because most of us go, wow, it's bad, delete it. Awesome. And then it just keeps coming. Now, I will tell you, obviously, if you report it, this does not guarantee the bad will stop. But I can also tell you, as somebody who does report a lot of this stuff, legitimate agencies will, in fact, do something about it. I particularly like to let other universities know, hey, you actually have a compromised account. And they're usually really grateful. And likewise, when they let us know. And we get notifications all the time that, oh, you have some person sending garbage, and that's one of the things I have to figure out is did it really come from us, right? So again, that's kind of back to this attribution stuff.
What we have here is this fun image. Oh, we lost the image. And there it goes. Well, hopefully it will come back like it did before. That's the fun image of birds, yes. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the history while we're waiting for that image to hopefully return. We'll see what happens here. Because my slide actually advanced. All right, cool. So, so what you can see in that, if you look very carefully in that little box in the top right, you see a picture from 1969, and this is kind of the beginning of collaborative computing, where you see the first email box at MIT. It was an application that sat on one machine, and users that shared the machine could share messages between each other. So it did not work like email that we think of today, because it didn't go anywhere. It just was like, hey, person on machine, I did this thing, and you should probably know that we saw whatever, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of the background behind that. So you can only view it on the same computer. Fast forward a few years, and we get to something called ARPANET. Now, the history of ARPANET is really the history of the internet. And the whole point of ARPANET was that you had 4 colleges that all had mainframes. And those mainframes needed some way to have a backup for each other. And if you read certain pieces of documentation, it will tell you it was because of the war and they were worried about if stuffing it. That's not really true. They really just wanted a backup system, so if one failed, they can continue research on the other. I mean, it was really research-driven, despite some of the war stuff you hear. So that's really where we see the first instance of email that looks anything like we have today, except, of course, it was restricted to ARPANET, so it was only those few little pieces. Then if you fast forward a couple more years, then we get much closer to what we think of today with email. So, you know, and it's used, again, for internal communications within these ARPANET nodes, which were all colleges all doing research. And you can see as this explodes, there's more and more nodes. So this is really kind of a history both of email and the internet. The current RFC, the request for comment, for those of you not familiar with RFCs, is 5321, and it's about SMTP, the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. And that's what dictates, this is how mail messages get sent from here to there. It came out a long time ago, and the most recent one was in 2008. They added some additions. In 2015, 7504 added the DMARC and DKIM and all that stuff that we'll talk about later. So this goes back a long while. If you're super duper geeky and you really want to understand more nuts and bolts, that's where you would go and look at it. All right. I don't think it likes my graphic. I think it doesn't like the image, the next image. Yeah, it doesn't like that. It's skipping. It's skipping pictures. All right, so the image that you can't see here is burning fire. And what it says is the burning question, right? Which is, where did this message originate? That's really what you can't see, because for whatever reason, it doesn't want to show you that. So we'll skip ahead to the next slide. And hopefully it will just go there. And then we'll get to DNS. There we go, DNS used in email. So how many of you know about DNS and sort of the basics of DNS? Most of you, okay. How many of you know how this works in email? Probably less of you, okay. So the important bit here is that it's still doing number to name translation. This is what we're basically all familiar with. The piece that email adds are these MX records. And MX records are essentially what say, hey, I have email for this domain. What are the addresses of the mail servers that you use to send mail and receive mail? And so DNS spits that information back, and that's very handy. Now, as I mentioned, the A records are going to be the IP associated with the host. So here's how this works. So it says, I want to send something to user@example.com. It's going to look for the NS record. Once it knows this is the information about the domain, it's going to query and say, well, what MX records? Where's the mail server? And if it has one, it's going to return it. And if there isn't, and this is sort of an interesting little tidbit, let's say your company doesn't have an MX record because they've been using an A record all these years, because it will default to whatever your default IP address is in that A record. And it will say, I'll just send it there if there's no MX record. So there's some weird routing things that go on just because this is the way it was designed. All right, this is the problem. And this is less of a problem in the US, especially today, than it was many, many years ago. But how many of you are familiar with this concept of the open relay? At least a good number of you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this open relay, the problem is that your mail servers are not just randomly supposed to accept messages from anyone anywhere, because that's bad, and then shuttle them along somewhere else. But we still see open relays, and when there are open relays, they will in fact accept messages from anyone to anywhere, and they don't care. This little block here of dots is what they should restrict to. It should only be local IP addresses, local mailboxes, meaning within that domain or one of these other permutations. All right, so here's where we get to the envelope versus header thing. And we're going to see why this matters when I show you a conversation between the client and the server. And I mentioned SMTP and ESMTP, which really it's just a newer version of SMTP, but it basically works the same way. So the difference between the envelope and the headers is that the envelope is generated as the message is generated. If you do this at a command line, you can actually see this. If you do not do this at a command line, unless you're running Wireshark, you will never, ever, ever see the envelope. But people confuse the term envelope because they think US Postal Service with headers and envelope. They sort of cross this information. We're going to see in a minute why this matters. So part of that creation is going to contain all of this info, the send, the from, and the receipt to, and that's what the servers are going to use to route the message. It doesn't matter whether it's legitimate or not legitimate. It's just going to use that information to route the message. Keep that in mind. So again, users can't see this. Now, it is incredibly easy to mess with. I was taught literally how to do this at a command line, and you can send mail so it looks from anyone from anywhere, right? Many of us know this, not everybody knows this, and they don't necessarily understand why that's the case, and this is the case. And so there are now clients you can buy that will just let you do this. But people who are only using those clients have never seen how this actually works. They don't necessarily understand what they're doing when they're sending fraudulent email, right? Did you have a question? Yes. Yeah. And when I say from the command line, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, absolutely. Was there another comment, question? Okay. So yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The header, on the other hand, is the thing that if you open the client and you dig into, you can find, and that is what gets written as the message gets forwarded along from server to server. By the time it starts down this path, all of this is gone. You don't see this. So unless you're doing it at Telnet on that command line or you're watching Wireshark, you will never see the envelope. So headers are more difficult to forge because they're moving from machine to machine. It's not impossible, but it's a little more challenging. Envelope is super easy to forge. So I love to refer to this as the dubious from field. When I'm teaching end users, I use this all the time, and it usually helps them remember, like, oh, this is like weird, and I should probably remember when I see from, it may not actually be from who it says it's from. So this is what I was talking about with the conversation. It starts out on the left-hand side and goes to the right-hand side. The left-hand side here, and I have a tool that actually lets me highlight some of this, but I have a feeling this projector doesn't like it, so I'm not going to try to use it. So I'm going to point, and if you have questions, just ask. So on this top left, we say, I have a message for somebody at a particular domain. And so the first thing we see is EHLO. So for those of you who didn't get the EHLO joke, there are two ways you can say hello to a mail server. One is hello, H-E-L-O, and the other is EHLO. Again, it's just sort of an updated version of that same conversation. That's where the EHLO comes from. So then the server is going to answer and say, hey, I can send mail for that domain. Cool. Here are some MX records, right? Because we talked about how that works. Then it's going to send the message. Now, this is what I was talking about with the envelope. So we have the mail from, this is the address, because that's what you've told it. And they say, okay, who's it for? Well, it's sending to this example. All right, what's the message? Now, in the data box, now I didn't create this image, but note the little box that I did create, which says the data portion of the message will usually contain to, from, and date. What do you think your end user is seeing when they see to, from, and date in a message? Right, but what are they seeing as far as what part of the mail message? They're not seeing the headers. They're seeing the data portion. And that, my friend, is exactly why this is a problem, because you can put anything you want in here. Anything at all. So the end user is only seeing that data portion. They're not seeing the headers. They never saw the envelope. The server saw the envelope. And if the server isn't stopped from sending a message because there aren't some rules saying, I can't accept messages for this domain, it will send it. It doesn't care who you are because it's allowed to send. So this is the fraudulent piece that attackers are effectively using to get at end users. And most people don't necessarily understand that piece. So here's the whole message. All right, I got it, quit, goodbye. So, you know, for those of you who've not sat down at port 25, telnetting in and doing this at command line, this is the conversation going on when you open your Outlook client or your Gmail client or whatever, and those two things are talking, and you're sending mail. And there's lots of ways to you know, subvert that. So here is an actual message that we had at the university, and we get these things all the time. These are employment scams. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your cousins, tell your aunts, tell your uncles. Tell everybody you know employment scams are a thing, and watch out for them, because we see it at all ages, in all job types. It doesn't matter. And I've erased who it looks like it's from, but what domain does it look like it's coming from? Buffalo.edu, and I work at the University of Buffalo. That's our domain. So the minute somebody sees it, they think it's coming from somebody at our university. And how is it signed? Oh, it's signed by somebody who supposedly works at the University of Buffalo. I'm offering you this job. And if you look up this individual in our directory, there is a person with that name who does work at the university who is a research analyst. So the attackers have done their homework. They have figured out who the person is they can emulate, and kids are desperate for jobs, and they will just respond. Now, anybody from Buffalo might take a look at the content of that message and go, 774 is not a Buffalo area code, okay? But in this day and age, we can have phones from anywhere, so they might just blow that off. But this is really, really, really common. Now, what else is weird about this message if you're really looking at it? The reply to, right? Okay, so this scammer was stupid because where does the reply to come from? Well, but how does it get in this message? They put it there. Oops, right? They actually put that in the message themselves, in the data portion. You don't see that. That's not a thing. So the only reason that you see that is because they did that. Mm-hmm. Correct. But the smart attacker can set the reply to without it being shown in the message. And that's usually a smart attacker won't actually put the reply to, but when you hit reply to, it will in fact do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. It has to be somebody who will answer legitimately. Well, but what happens typically is that the person will answer as it's the bad actor who's answering the phone as if they're this person. Yep. All right, so what we're going to see, we're going to take a look at the actual header of this message, but I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to read that first. I've given this talk before, and I put this slide and the next slide, I keep switching which order they're in. But people seem to prefer having the here's what we're going to see, and then we look at the slide with the header. So we'll go back and forth as we sort of need to. But here are the things you're going to look for in that header. So remember that the header is appended every time the mail goes from one server to another. So every hop, you're going to see a new line. The really important thing to remember is that you read email headers from the bottom up. You don't read them from the top down. We're not used to that. Now, there are some mail clients who will append email headers in the wrong order, which is really annoying for those of us who've been doing this a long time. So just be aware of that. You need to pay attention to time and date stamps. I mean, you need to anyway, because that can tell us some stuff about what's going on. But just make sure that in general, you're reading from bottom up, and that is, in fact, what you should be doing. So I always say read from bottom up like a sloth, because your sloth is hanging upside down and reading from the bottom up, okay? So you're going to start at looking for the very first received from. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at that message header, we're going to go to the bottom, and we're going to scroll our eyes up until we see that first received from. Now, sometimes there's a received from that's like a non-routable address, and then you kind of have to look for the next one up from that, the actual first legitimate one. But basically, it's the first received from. That's where the message originated. Now, this has gotten more complicated in the sense that now with like Office 365 mail and Gmail and some of these things that, you have all these different companies, they're using it. It's hard to tell, is this legitimate? What you can tell is, okay, this came through Gmail. And then you have to go back and do some searching to say, does this company use Gmail? And usually you can dig that out, but it can be a pain in the butt. So we're going to look for inconsistencies. We're gonna check if there's an embedded URL, does it match the domain? Like, does it make sense? If I'm sending this and it appears to come from Buffalo EDU and it talks about Buffalo EDU things, is the link for, some other really weird domain? Because certainly we see that. Again, we talked about the timestamps. Make sure you check offsets, because if it goes through different mail servers that are configured, either mail servers on different time zones or mail servers that have been configured differently, that can screw you up if you're looking at the details here. And don't forget about the element of human verification. So talk to the person that you're trying to verify this for. If you have questions, they can be really useful. So let's look at this header. And again, I wanted to be able to use my tool to highlight this. But I did put this in Notepad++. So I'm hoping, if nothing else, you can see the little numbers along the side. They're tiny, but so if you look at the very bottom, like 43 through 49, that is going to be, basically some of your data stuff. But if you look up at 41, and I actually have my little cursor there, you'll see a received from. Do we see that? Can we see? I know it's tiny, but you can see it? Okay. Because, like I said, what this is supposed to do is make a nice bubble so I can highlight that. But technology, so much fun. Yeah, sure, I'll use a pointer. That'd be great. Great, thank you. All right, let's see. There we go. So this is what I'm talking about right here. See this guy? 161.116.109.12 in this port. So that's kind of weird. What does this say? Not the envelope part, sorry, I'm right above that. Websitewelcome.com. What the heck does that have to do with Buffalo EDU? Anything? Probably not. This is another tricky bit, right? So it can be the case that third-party mailers are used by an entity, so you have to keep that in mind. But in this particular case, this website welcome thing is something that allows relaying, and we see this all the time. So there's certain domains you'll start to, if you do this often enough, where you'll go, oh, I know what this is. This is garbage. And their abuse folks are actually pretty good about I can email abuse at, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, I mean, this is really what we're looking for. We're looking for, it doesn't want to give me the dot. There we go. So we looked for this first receive from, and then it moves on from receive from, And then it's within their sort of universe, right? And it's received by their gateway. And then eventually we see it received by MX2, which was one of our MX servers, or MX records on our mail servers. We had, the University of Buffalo has always had very complicated email. And so for a long time, we had what were called edge mail servers because we had multiple email services within the university. So what would happen is email would arrive at these edge servers and that they would know, oh, this person's mailbox is here. This person's mailbox is here. So in our case, when you see the MX2, that's really what, why can't I get this to, does not want to, there it is, okay. So when you see MX2, that's why, because those are our mail exchangers. And so, and you'll see these weird references to Google right here. That's because one of the things we accept mail from, so Google.com, is Gmail. Our students are on Gmail. So this message was sent to a student, and that's, if we're going from where it started to where it's going, it's accepted by our MX server, and then it's relayed to Google because our students are in the Gmail universe. So that, you know, this is the basic idea, and you just work your way up from one layer to the next. And it can be very confusing, only because there's sometimes a lot of extra garbage. You sometimes will see a lot of references. In this particular one, we don't see a lot of information about SPF or DKIM, DMARC, which we'll talk about in a minute. There can be information that can be useful and sometimes not useful, depending on what we're talking about. So any questions on any of this so far with the header specifically? Yeah. I have, in the sense that I can pull the header quickly to look at the header information, but the analyzer tool does not always tell me what I need to know. It'll show me the headers very quickly, but the analyzer will not necessarily tell me where the mail actually originated. It sometimes will tell me that it came from one of our users when it didn't. If I look at the headers, I can tell that. So it's not foolproof. So I don't find it, like, I find it useful in terms of pulling it up and looking at what it says. Other questions? Yes? So the first thing I'm going to look for is I need to understand my own, university's mail systems. So if I know that we don't send mail through website welcome, that's the first tip off. This did not originate at UB because we don't use that service at all for anything. We now are a Microsoft 365 shop, and so what that header will show me initially, if it came from us, is it's going to show like it's coming from Outlook.com. But there are some other tells that will tell me whether or not it really came from us, and then I can cross-reference with the Microsoft tools to be absolutely sure it routed through us. Because the tools can be very, very useful. They can also be misleading. So it just depends on how well you know your environment. But that is without a doubt the very first thing I would look for is, if I expect the message, did it come from where I would expect it? Did it come from our domain? If we're a Google shop, did it come from Google? And that's where it gets tricky. So if it comes from Outlook.com, but somebody is spoofing one of our users and also using Outlook.com, how do I know whether it actually came from us, right? And that's where you have to look at the in-house tools to kind of tell the actual routing of that message. Did it route through our server or not? And it's sometimes easy and sometimes not easy. Yes? How would I what? Get a view like this? We're going to talk about that. That's a great question. We're going to talk about that in a second. Any other questions about this so far? Okay, cool. Moving on. I don't think I have any more fancy pictures, so there we go. So this is the beginning of the answer to the question you just asked. So when you're going to report the badness, you need to know what domain the badness is coming from. That's going to be the first thing you're going to do. Sometimes you can just send email to abuse@domain. That used to be like the default thing everybody did. That is not always the case now. So now you have to you have to research that. So you have to go to different tools. It used to, in the old days, we used to have to manually do a whois, NS lookup, and find out all this stuff. Now there are some pretty awesome tools that will give you all of that information right away, and we'll talk about what some of those are. Some providers have special forms. So if there's something coming from Gmail that's badness, they actually have this abuse form that you can click on, and they want, you know, a contact information from you. They want the email address that's being used. They want the full headers, the content of the message. So they want a bunch of stuff. I never hear anything back from Google, but I also very seldom see the same address used. And it is whack-a-mole to a certain degree, but still, it does, you know, take them down. AWS has a similar abuse form that you have to fill out. So if you look up the domain and you find out that all the information is redacted, because GDPR is now a thing, when we used to be able to do what's called a whois, and we'd look up the domain, it would give us the contact information, who to report abuse to. And that was super helpful because we could tell them, hey, stop sending us crap. You have an account that's compromised, or your service is wide open to the universe and it shouldn't be, or whatever, right? Well, you could tell them. Well, now with GDPR, all you see is redacted for privacy. Who's seen that? Some of you. How annoying is that? Oh my goodness, it is hella annoying. So how do you get around that? Well, it's not easy. Sometimes you can do some historical looking back. If it hasn't changed radically, you can use old data. You can use, so there are different sources that can tell you like different domains or IPs, historical information that they got before the GDPR stuff was in there. Sometimes if you do some Googling, you can find out, you know, on occasion, if it's especially what I find with like a K through 12 school district, I will find the email address of their IT people and I will send it to them directly. And I will say, I think you have a problem. And more often than not, I get an email back saying, oh my goodness, thank you so much, we didn't know. So sometimes it does require a little digging. Yep, so there are some domains, Alibaba, they don't care. I don't typically report Russian addresses because Russia does not care. It is very rare, and you kind of don't even want them to know that you're paying attention. So, you know, unfortunately, there are some there's just nothing you can do with. But there are some that are really, really good about it. And you can report bad URLs within the message in the same way. So if you have a phishing message, and I do this all the time, we just had, and I should have screenshot this. Somebody created a website that mimicked what should have looked like a University of Buffalo web page that had all of the top people in our central IT infrastructure, their photographs, their names, their titles, and it claimed that, you know, we sold Bitcoin and here's some financial investment thing that you should do. And it was really convincing. It used our logos and it was phenomenal. And thankfully, it was on Namecheap. And with Namecheap, if you tweet at them, they will make it go away. And iHeart Malware is the one who told me that. So, you know, if you don't already follow him, he's amazing. He does a lot of work in the business email compromise space, and he's got some fabulous tips. So anytime I have one of these that I'm trying to get taken down ASAP, and I'm like, hey, do you know anybody? And so sometimes it's all about who you know, and it can be really, really helpful. You can also submit URLs to VirusTotal. That's another way to get that stuff taken down. But I've been fairly successful. Like Google is terrible about taking down forms. Like they just forget it. Like you can submit it. They eventually get around to it. They're not quick about it. But it's the same process. You just submit it to them. So any questions on the badness stuff? Okay. So I promised you some additional email concepts. So these RFCs were written. There were some new additions to the RFCs that came out, as I said, in 2015, I think. And email by default. Now, you remember that conversation between the mail server and the client that I showed you? Where in there was there anything about security? There wasn't, right? Because if you read the original RFC and you saw the history of how email started, there was no reason for there to be security, which was the whole point of me showing you some of that history, is to understand, look, none of that matters. None of that matters. Because at the end of the day, email was just supposed to be a way for me to send a little bit of text from me to you and you to me, and that was it. And now it's used worldwide for business purposes and all kinds of other transactions. But they didn't think about that when it was all being created. They thought, we're going to back up some servers that are going to do some research, and we're going to like leave messages for each other. So it occurred to some folks, you know, fast forward, maybe we needed some better ways to secure mail. So these things are add-ons, is what I will tell you. It is not, this stuff's not turned on by default. It's not just there. It can be a royal pain in the butt to implement, some of it more than others. So we'll go through this. I'm not, like I said, I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on it. So SPF records, they're just gonna validate that like where it's coming from, that IP address and the domain owner are the same, and so therefore it should come. But you can put in an SPF record that doesn't reject anything. And the SPF records can be accepted or rejected at the other end, they don't care. So you, at the other end, you can't control that. So like right now we have SPF records in place because we had other places that were rejecting mail because we did not have one at all. So that's become a thing. But again, they could do that anyway. They could just be like, well, you have one and it's not configured in the way we want it to, so we're still gonna reject your email. So DKIM takes it to another level. It adds this digital signature, which says it really supposedly came from who it came from. And DMARC is essentially the two being married together and is supposed to provide this real verification. What you will see in the headers is you will see references to these things, and sometimes you will see that the authentication worked or it didn't, or it was required or it wasn't. And that all depends on your configuration and the other end's configuration and who accepts what, and it's not perfect. And so what I tend to tell people is there is no such thing as true secure email. There just isn't. The minute you send it from here to there, there's a risk. But in reality, there are some better ways to secure email. One of them is simply encryption. And, you know, but generally speaking, what these tools are going to help with is they're going to prevent things like spoofing. So they can be really helpful. But if you have a lot of third-party mailers, this can be a real nightmare to implement. We're actually right in that process now at the university. And there are also some limitations in terms of subdomains, and yeah. So any questions on this? Okay. So here are the tools I mentioned. I'm hoping these screenshots will show up. They're not super complicated, but we'll see. So Domain Dossier is the main place that I really like because it gives some great information, all the stuff that us old fogies used to go and do by hand, the NS lookup and the, you know, who owns the IP address, who owns the domain, what information can we have about who to let know about all of this. A lot of that can be found with Domain Dossier. MX Toolbox can give you stuff about the headers and the MX records. CyberChef can be really handy if you're looking at like, you've got some kind of weird email that has some kind of encoded crap in it, and you're like, ooh, tell me about this encoding. It does some magic decoding, which is pretty amazing. And the message header analyzer, you know, does some basic header analysis. But as I mentioned, headers are weird, and sometimes clients do things upside down and backwards. So be aware that when you feed this stuff into a header analyzer, it may not be as helpful as you think it's going to be. So I find it's not better to use these. It's better to use my eyes and go line by line if I have to. So, oh good. So this is Domain Dossier. This is essentially, I mean, it keeps going, but this gives you just kind of a basic sense of what you're looking at. So you can see in this particular case, it doesn't find any particular domain that's associated with that IP, but it still can give you all kinds of information about who owns it. So, if you look and see Afrinek, that's not the US, so that's definitely not us, and not something we're likely to use. So this is MX Toolbox. If you look carefully, you can see there are a bunch of different lookups it can do. It can tell you some DMARC stuff. It can tell you if the information is on a blacklist. So this can be kind of handy. Yeah, if you're diagnosing your own mail server and you're trying to figure out why stuff isn't flowing, yeah, that can be really handy too. This is CyberChef. What's fun about CyberChef is you can't see all the little boxes. They're sort of grayed out, but you put the input is whatever text you want to decrypt, and then you put like from base64, because a lot of that stuff's base64. You just click and drag over whatever it is you want it to use, and it'll give you the output. So if you're looking at some sort of gobbledygook in a message and you need to try to decode it, this is one of the tools that I use when I'm looking at like weird phishing messages. And in some cases, right even in the address of URL, this can be really handy if you're trying to sort of dig in further. And this is Message Analyzer, where you're literally going to copy and paste in the headers, click Analyze, and it's going to tell you some stuff. And it can be useful, but sometimes it gets it backwards and it misses things. And but again, if you're not used to looking at headers and you need a place to start, it's not a bad place to start. So I like this quote, and I'll end with this quote and then a couple minutes for questions. I started in this field doing workstation and server support a long time ago, but my origins were actually in the music industry. So, I may not have gone where I was originally intending to go, but ultimately I think I wound up exactly where I needed to be. And with that, any questions? Thank you. Yes? So I wanted to work in record companies, which I actually did for a couple years. I worked for Polygram Group Distribution, and I worked for a little indie label called Critique Records. And it was fun and I enjoyed it, but I ultimately decided I had morals and ethics that kept me from continuing in that field. I ran a record store for a while, and when the record store closed, I had to find a new line of work. And to make a very long story short, I had a friend who said, you should go into tech. And I said, what do I know about tech? And he's like, you know more than you realize. And 26 years later, I guess, here I am. So, any other questions? Yeah. Is there what? Is there any danger in replying to any email? Sure, of course there is, because you don't know who's at the other end, right? There are people who like to screw with attackers. It sounds like that's something you might like doing. What I will tell you is you don't know who's on the other end. Unless you really know what you're doing, it's probably not a good idea to antagonize attackers. I have friends that do this, like when phone solicitors call and they're just like, I'm gonna get them, And I always think that's great, but they might know where you live now, and maybe that's not a good idea. So yes. Question?
Say along with that, replying to them too, that tells them there's somebody that's reading emails and it's a good address.
Yeah, it's legitimate. Yeah. Yep, you're confirming that address, exactly. And I get asked all the time about unsubscribe. That's another thing too, right? Like, if it's a legit company, because you've been to Black Hat and you've gotten your badge scanned, if you unsubscribe, that's probably okay because, But if it's just like some fly-by-night you've never heard of kind of scammy thing, I would not be hitting unsubscribe because you don't know what's going on there. So, any other questions? All right, well, I will be around for the rest of the conference. So again, thank you so very much for coming.